The chamber was enormous. It had been built to impress, and it did its job well. The ceiling was so high that the lights near the top looked like small cold stars. The walls were carved from a pale stone that no human had ever seen before they joined the conclave. 11 flags hung from the upper beams, one for each species that called itself a member of the Grand Conclave of Civilized Worlds. The human flag was at the far end, slightly smaller than the others. No one had ever said why. Ambassador Yara Chen sat in the human seat and looked at the flags. She had been coming to this chamber for 9 years. She knew every crack in the floor, every echo in the high ceiling, every face of every diplomat who had smiled at her with their mouth while saying something else with their eyes. She was 44 years old, and she had stopped being surprised by anything a very long time ago. The session had been going for 3 hours. The charges against humanity had been read aloud by a Vethani elder named Sorath, whose voice was calm and clear, and carried the particular tone of someone who had rehearsed what he was saying many times. The Vethani were tall, pale, and deeply allergic to disorder. Sorath had been building toward this moment for 2 years, and everyone in the room knew it. The list was long. Humans had, during their 60 years of conclave membership, violated trade agreements on 7 separate occasions. They had sent armed ships into buffer zones without prior notification. They had made backroom deals with minor species outside the conclave framework. They had developed weapons technology without sharing it with the Oversight Committee. They had, on 3 recorded occasions, started a conflict and then won it so quickly that the conclave peace envoys arrived to find nothing left to mediate. But the charge that drew the most murmuring from the assembled delegates was the last one. Sorath read it slowly, as though he wanted the words to land. Humanity appears to treat crisis as a normal condition, he said. They do not merely survive catastrophe, they function better in it. This is not a trait compatible with a peaceful, cooperative interstellar community. It is a trait compatible with a predator. Yara Chen listened to all of it without moving. She sat with her hands flat on the table, her back straight, her face neutral. The delegate from the Shenkai leaned over to her at one point and whispered something that might have been an apology. She did not respond. When Sorath finished, the floor was opened for other voices. 12 delegates spoke. Most of them agreed with the motion. 2 expressed concern about economic disruption. 1, a young Drellani named Fea, argued that humanity's faults had to be weighed against their contributions. The 14 emergency rescues, the 3 plague responses, the infrastructure work in the outer systems. Fea's speech was passionate and well-sourced, and changed exactly no minds. Then it was humanity's turn. Chen stood up. She was not a tall woman. She wore a plain gray suit, no medals, no insignia beyond the small silver pin that marked her rank. She looked at the 11 flags, then at the 11 faces looking back at her, and then she spoke. "All right," she said, "we'll show ourselves out." Silence. Sorath blinked. He had prepared a response to any possible argument Chen might make. He had notes, counterpoints, historical precedents. He had not prepared a response to this. Chen gathered her papers, placed them in her case, and walked toward the door. She did not look back. Her 2 aides stood and followed her without a word. The door opened, and for a moment the sound of the corridor outside entered the chamber. Ordinary and unhurried, and then it closed again. The vote was taken anyway, 94% in favor. Earth's star was removed from the official charts that same afternoon. In the corridor, one of Chen's aides, a young man named Torres, looked at her as they walked. "That's it?" he said. "We're just going?" "We were already gone," Chen said. "I just made it official." She did not explain what she meant. Torres had learned, after 2 years working with her, that she rarely explained things before you were ready to understand them. On the transport back to the human station at the edge of conclave space, Chen sat alone in the forward cabin and opened her personal console. There was a message waiting for her. It had been sent 3 hours ago, timed to arrive the moment the session ended, as though the sender had known the outcome before it happened. The subject line read, "Project Closed Door. Phase 1 begins today." Chen read the message twice. Then she put the console away and looked out the viewport at the stars. They were the same stars she had always seen from this part of space, scattered and cold, and utterly indifferent to the decisions of any species, no matter how old or how proud. She did not look sad. Torres, watching her from the doorway, could not quite identify what she looked like. He thought about it for a long time, on the long ride home. He decided, eventually, that she looked like someone who had just been told the rules of a game they had already been winning. Back in the conclave chamber, the 11 delegates filed out in small groups, talking quietly. Most of them felt satisfied. The decision had been clean and clear, which was rare for conclave proceedings. The human problem, as several of them had come to call it privately, had been resolved. Fea, the young Dralani delegate, was the last to leave. She stood alone in the chamber and looked at the space where the human flag had hung. They had taken it down already. There was a small rectangular patch on the stone where the light was slightly different, where years of hanging fabric had kept the surface from weathering. She thought about Chen's 7 words for a long time. "All right, we'll show ourselves out." There had been something in Chen's voice, not anger, not grief, something quieter than both, something almost like relief. Fea filed her concern in the report she sent to her government that evening. She described the moment carefully, because she was a careful person. She wrote that she did not know what it meant. She wrote that she thought it was worth paying attention to. Her report was logged, reviewed by a mid-level analyst, and filed in a drawer. No one followed up on it. That was the first mistake. The first month after the vote, no one in the conclave noticed anything wrong. This was expected. Humanity had always been a minor annoyance. Loud, difficult, unreliable. Their absence should have been a relief, and for a few weeks, it was. The chamber sessions were shorter. The arguments were cleaner. The Vethani elder Sorath told a colleague that the air itself seemed lighter, which was not literally true, but felt true in the way that only ideology can make things feel. The second month, small things started to go wrong. A supply line for processed mineral cores through the outer reach came up short. The humans had been the secondary carrier on that route, not the main one, just the backup, the ones who filled in when the primary route was delayed. No one had thought to replace them because no one had thought of them as essential. They had just always been there, the way a tool is always in the drawer until the day you need it, and reach in and find the drawer empty. Then a medical shipment from the Dralani systems arrived at the Keth homeworld 2 weeks late, because the human relay station at Marker Point had gone dark. The humans had been running that station for 30 years. There were forms for this. There were backup protocols. The backup protocols required the Vethani to take over the station. The Vethani had technically agreed to this in a treaty signed 22 years ago. They had no staff trained to operate it. By the third month, 17 supply chains had gaps in them. Some were small, a few were not. The Conclave Economics Committee met in emergency session. They catalogued the disruptions and found, to their considerable embarrassment, that humanity had been quietly holding together a large section of the infrastructure that no one had been paying attention to. Not because the humans had designed it that way, just because they had shown up, done the work, and not made a fuss about it. This information was discussed, adjustments were made, the problems were managed, more or less. But around this same time, a conclave intelligence vessel named the Quiet Survey was sent to observe Sol's system from a respectful distance. This was standard procedure after any major political change. A census of sorts, a way of knowing what was happening, so that whatever happened next would not be a surprise. The Quiet Survey had been in position for 6 days when its analyst, a Keth named Murak, filed an urgent report. She described what she was seeing in plain, measured language. There was construction happening around Earth's moon. Not small construction. Enormous, accelerated construction. The kind that only happened when a species was genuinely motivated, when every available worker and machine had been pointed at the same goal. The scale of it was hard to calculate from her distance, but her best estimate was that what she was seeing represented decades of normal industrial output, compressed into months. She attached her visual data and sent it home. The report was read by exactly 6 people. On Luna, Commander Elias Voss stood at the edge of Bay 12 and watched the framework rising against the black sky. He was 51 years old, with a face that looked like it had been left out in bad weather for a long time, and hands that had been building things since he was 6. He had been given command of the closed-door shipyards 4 days after the vote, which meant 4 days after Earth had decided, quietly and without announcement, that this was going to happen. "Ahead of schedule," said his second-in-command, a woman named Paz, coming to stand beside him. "We're always ahead of schedule when people stop telling us what we can't do," Voss said. Paz looked at the framework. "You think they're watching?" "Someone's watching," Voss said. "There's always someone watching. Let them." He did not say this with anger. He said it with the particular calm of a man who knows exactly where he is going and has stopped caring whether anyone else approves. The shipyards were not the only thing being built. On Mars, 2 new processing facilities had come online. In the asteroid belt, 7 mining operations that had been in planning for years were suddenly all at once, fully funded and fully staffed. On Earth itself, 3 universities that had been quietly working on theoretical jump drive improvements had received budgets that made their researchers laugh out loud when they first saw the numbers, because they thought there had been a mistake. There had been no mistake. The mood, which was the thing that the Quiet Survey's report had struggled to describe, was the strangest part of all. Murak had used the word focused. It was not quite right, but it was the closest she could get. The humans were not angry. They were not sad. They were not performing a dramatic response to a great injustice. They were simply doing things, at a speed and with an intensity that suggested they had been waiting for permission that they no longer needed to wait for. A Keth merchant named Reth was the only outsider who got close enough to confirm this with his own eyes. He was technically violating the embargo. The Conclave had asked all member species to cease trade contact with the Sol system, but Reth had a ship, a debt, and a business relationship with a human parts supplier that was easier to maintain than to replace. He docked at the human station above Mars on a quiet afternoon, expecting to find the place subdued. He found it humming. The station was busier than he had ever seen it. Workers were moving with the quick, certain walk of people who know exactly what they are doing and exactly where they need to be. The cargo bays were full. The repair docks were full. There was music playing somewhere deep in the station, not loud, just there, a background thread of sound. He found his usual contact, a logistics manager named Dio, in the middle of coordinating 3 separate cargo transfers at once. She looked at him, grinned, and pointed at a corner where he could wait. When she finally came over, she shook his hand the way humans always did, firm, brief, like a small agreement being made. "Heard what happened," Reth said carefully. He was not sure what tone to take. "Good news travels fast," Dio said. "I thought it was bad news." Dio tilted her head slightly, the way a human did when they were considering how much to explain. "It depends who's measuring," she said. Reth filed his own report when he got home. He was not a political person, but he was an observant one, and what he had seen bothered him in a way he could not quite name. He described it to his brother that evening as the feeling of watching someone you had underestimated walk away from an argument still smiling. The brother said that sounded fine to him. Reth said he hoped he was right. His report reached the Conclave intelligence desk 2 weeks later. It was the 4th report in 10 days to use some version of the same phrase. Each analyst had come to the same observation independently, from different angles, with different data. The phrase was this: "They do not seem to be suffering." Sorath read the reports one evening in his office. He sat with them for a long time after he finished. Outside his window, the Conclave towers were lit up in the blue-white light they used at night, orderly and calm, exactly as they should be. He thought about Chen's face in the chamber, the neutral expression, the flat hands on the table, the 7 words, and the short walk to the door. He had expected anger. He had prepared for anger. He had been certain, in the way that only deeply confident people can be certain, that humanity would argue, or beg, or threaten, and that the conclave would weather it with dignity. He had not prepared for a species that simply agreed, turned around, and went home to build something. He sat with that thought until the lights outside changed, and then he went to bed, and in the morning, he told himself it was nothing to worry about. He was not entirely sure he believed himself. It started with a probe. The Thani exploration vessel Pale Hand was running a routine survey of the outer edge of the Sol system, the kind of pass that had been done dozens of times before the vote, and was now considered a necessary monitoring exercise. The crew was small, professional, and not expecting anything interesting. The sector was classified as inactive. The humans were in there somewhere, being quiet, and reportedly very busy. But the Pale Hand was keeping a respectful distance. Then the navigator noticed something on the long-range sensors. She described it in her log as a resonance pattern, a faint, regular pulse that was too ordered to be natural, and too large to be machinery in any traditional sense. It ran in a line from somewhere near Jupiter's orbit out to the very edge of the system. And then when she looked more carefully, she found the other lines. There were 9 of them. They formed a rough sphere around the entire Sol system, each line connecting nodes that she could barely detect as distinct objects at this range. She reported it to the captain. The captain reported it to Conclave Intelligence. Conclave Intelligence sent a second vessel, then a third. The third vessel, wanting better data, sent a probe across the line. The probe's signal vanished between 1 second and the next. No distress signal, no last transmission, no debris on the sensors. It simply stopped existing, as far as the instruments could tell. They sent a second probe. Same result. The captain of the third vessel wrote in her report that whatever the humans had built, it was not a wall. A wall stopped things. This stopped things, and left no record that they had ever arrived. She could think of only one reason to build something like that, and the reason made her uncomfortable. You build a door, not a wall, when you want the option to open it from one side. 3 days later, a message arrived on all conclave communication frequencies simultaneously. It was short, spoken in clean standard with no accent, and delivered in a tone that was neither aggressive nor apologetic. It was the tone of someone reading the terms of an arrangement that had already been decided. Sol system is now a closed border. Entry without authorization is not permitted. Trespass will not be warned against twice. That was all. No name, no title, no return frequency, no offer to discuss terms. The conclave held an emergency session that afternoon. Sorath opened it with a request for calm, which told everyone present that he was not calm himself. The chief science advisor, a Keth named Dresser, presented the data from the 3 vessels. The resonance lines, the missing probes, the size of the network. When she put the full map up on the chamber display, Sol system at the center, the lattice running around it like an enormous invisible shell. The room was quiet for a long time. How long would this take to build? Sorath asked. At normal construction rates, Dresser said, 40 years, minimum. More likely 60. And at the rates we've been observing in Sol system over the past 18 months? Dresser paused. Possibly 18 months. More quiet. A Shenkai delegate raised the question that everyone was already thinking. Is this technology from their existing research programs? We don't know, Dresser said. The components we can analyze from probe wreckage are human-made. The underlying theory, if they developed it themselves, represents a significant jump beyond anything we believed they were capable of. She stopped, then said the harder part. It's possible they were capable of it for some time, and chose not to demonstrate that capability. The chamber absorbed this. Inside Sol system, the person most responsible for the lattice was sitting in a small office on the Luna station, eating a meal she had forgotten to eat 4 hours earlier. Dio Adeyemi was 29 years old, lead engineer on the node network, and so tired that the walls had started to look soft around the edges. She had been working on the closed door project since she was 25, when it had been a theoretical paper written by 3 people in a basement lab at the Nairobi Engineering Institute. The paper had been titled, very boringly, On the Feasibility of Localized Spacetime Interruption Fields, and it had spent 2 years sitting in an archive before someone in Earth Command found it and understood what it was actually saying. What it was saying was, you can close a door if you understand the hinges. A younger colleague, a boy named Sato, who had joined the team 6 months ago and still got excited about things, sat down across from her. It works, he said. He had clearly been wanting to say it out loud to someone. It works, Dio agreed. How does it feel? Dio thought about it. You know when you've been living somewhere with a broken lock on the front door, she said, and you've been meaning to fix it, but you never have, and so you just sort of get used to the fact that anyone could walk in if they wanted to? Sato nodded. It feels like I finally fixed the lock, Dio said. Sato looked out the viewport at the stars. Do you think they'll try to break it? Probably, Dio said, but not for a while. Right now they're still trying to figure out how it works. She was right. The Conclave science teams worked for 3 months on the probe wreckage data and got nowhere useful. The technology was identifiably human. The manufacturing signatures, the material composition, the basic engineering approach. But the specific application, the way the nodes spoke to each other across vast distances to create a coherent field, was something none of their models could explain. It was not that the humans had found a new principle. It was that they had taken an old principle and pushed it so much further than anyone else had tried, that the result looked like something entirely different. This was, Dresser told her research team privately, the most unsettling kind of discovery. Unknown technology could be feared as an alien thing, technology you almost recognized, built from familiar pieces, arranged in a way you had somehow never considered, made you feel something worse than fear. It made you feel slow. The Conclave held a second emergency session 6 weeks after the first. This one was not about the technology. It was about the message. One word in it had been the subject of 17 separate intelligence analyses. Not the warnings, not the boundary declaration. One word. Authorization. Sol's system is now a closed border. Entry without authorization is not permitted. The word implied that authorization was possible. It implied that someone could grant it. It implied that the door, while closed, had a handle. Sorath had read those 17 analyses. He had read them carefully and thought about them for a long time. And in the session when the delegate from the Drellani asked whether the Conclave should attempt to make contact and request clarification, he found that he could not argue against it. Because the alternative, simply accepting that humanity had sealed themselves away, and that the matter was settled, felt, against all reason, like exactly what they wanted. One junior Vithani analyst, a meticulous woman named Tova, filed a note at the end of her report that her supervisor read twice and then left unmarked. It said simply, at every point in the sequence of events, the human's behavior is consistent with a plan that was already in place before the vote. She had no evidence for this. It was a feeling, and she noted it as such. She wrote, I do not know what they were waiting for. I am not sure they needed to wait for anything in particular. I think the vote simply gave them a clean starting point. Her supervisor moved on to the next report. Outside, the lattice held, silent and steady. The trouble in the Vreth expanse had been building for a long time. The Vreth expanse was a loose cluster of systems on the far side of conclave space. 3 species living in close proximity, sharing resources, and disagreeing about almost everything. The Marin, the Jathali, and the Krovan had been quarreling over mineral rights, water routes, and old territorial claims for generations. The quarrels had never quite become a war, because the humans had been running a patrol circuit through the region, as part of a treaty signed 14 years ago. They had not done much, they had just been present. Ships passing through on a regular schedule, stopping occasionally to talk to someone, visible in the way that a single calm voice in a heated room is visible. The treaty had been quietly cancelled when Earth was voted out. The patrol circuit had ended. No one had assigned a replacement. For 7 months, nothing happened. Then the Marin seized a Jathali water station, and the Jathali responded by blockading a Marin fuel depot. And the Krovan announced they were allied with the Jathali because of a 60-year-old agreement that everyone had assumed was purely ceremonial. The Conclave sent a peace envoy. The envoy was patient, experienced, and skilled, and she had no ships and no credibility with any of the three parties, because the Conclave's credibility in the Vreth expanse had been built largely by human presence, and human presence was no longer there. The envoy did her best. Her best produced 2 months of talks that ended without agreement. Back in the Conclave chamber, the session that was supposed to address the Vreth situation lasted 4 hours, and produced a great deal of very good argument and no conclusion. The problem was simple and humiliating. The Conclave did not have the reach. The Vreth expanse was on the far edge. Getting there required supply chains and relay stations that had, over the past year, developed gaps. Several of those gaps were in places their humans had previously operated. Someone eventually said out loud what the room had been thinking for an hour. "We need to ask them." The silence that followed was the longest of the session. The vote to send a formal request to Sol system passed by a narrow margin. 41 in favor, 37 against, with several notable abstentions from delegates who wanted to be on the right side of history, regardless of which side that turned out to be. The transmission was sent to the edge of the Sol lattice on a standard diplomatic frequency. It was formal, carefully worded, and it took 4 drafts to remove every phrase that sounded either too proud or too desperate. The final version was both, in the way that all requests sound when they are made by someone who does not want to be making them. It asked for human re-engagement with the Conclave. It cited the Vreth situation. It expressed a willingness to discuss the terms of a new relationship. It did not apologize. The Vethani delegation had blocked that paragraph in the 4th draft. Inside Sol, the message was received, decoded, and read by 6 people before it reached Elder Ambassador Yara Chen. She was in a garden on the roof of the Earth Council building in Nairobi, when Torres, still her aide after 3 years, handed her the printed copy. She read it once. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket and went back to looking at the garden. "They want us back," Torres said. "They want help," Chen said. "That's not the same thing." "Is there a difference?" "There is for us," Chen said. The Earth Council debated for 3 weeks. It was not a polite debate. There were people who wanted to refuse entirely. Let the Conclave manage its own problems. Let the Vreth situation resolve itself. Let the lesson land as hard as it needed to. There were people who wanted to say yes immediately, on principle, because the Vreth people were suffering, regardless of what the Conclave had or hadn't done. There were people who wanted to negotiate, to turn this moment into the foundation of something more lasting and more equal. Chen said very little during the debates. She listened, and she asked occasional questions, and when pressed for her view she said only that they should let them wait a little longer. This annoyed several council members. It also, in the end, won the argument, because Chen was not someone whose instincts people ignored. 6 weeks after the Conclave's message, the human response arrived. It was not a yes. It was not a no. But it was a document, 31 numbered points, laid out in plain language, without decoration or softening. Each point described a specific condition that would govern any renewed relationship between humanity and the Conclave. Sovereignty over all current human-controlled systems, with no Conclave oversight authority. Trade rights on equal terms, not preferential. The right to expand into unclaimed systems without approval, notification, or delay. Shared security arrangements based on mutual benefit, not obligation. A permanent seat at any diplomatic table where human interests were relevant, separate from and equal to the existing Conclave structure. The Conclave diplomats read the document twice through before anyone spoke. "These are reasonable," said Fea, now 3 years older and considerably less surprised by humanity than she had been. "They're not reasonable," said Sorath. "They're audacious." "Both things can be true," Fea said. What no one said out loud, but what most of them were thinking, was that the terms were exactly what a wise outside observer would have suggested humanity should have had from the beginning. There was nothing in the list that was punitive. There was nothing designed to embarrass the conclave. The 31 points were simply the terms of a relationship between equals who had both been pretending, for 60 years, that they were not. While the conclave deliberated, something else happened. A human fleet, 11 ships, appeared at the edge of the Vreth expanse. They had not been sent by the conclave. They had simply calculated that the Vreth situation was getting worse, that people were going to get hurt, and that they could fix it. They fixed it in 11 days. Not by force. They docked at the Marin station first, then the Jethali, then the Krovan, one after another, and they talked to people. They knew the region. They had been running that circuit for 14 years. They knew the names of the station managers, the local grievances, the history, the pressure points, and the fact that the Marin station commander had a daughter who had studied at a human university and spoke to her old professors twice a year. They found the points where an agreement was possible, and they pushed on those points, and they offered specific things, supply guarantees, water routing adjustments, a temporary security presence, that they had the actual capacity to deliver. When it was done, they sent a short message to the conclave diplomatic frequency. Vreth expanse situation resolved. We handled it. This one's free. The message was read by the full conclave chamber the next morning. Sorath sat with it for a long time. He was not a man who arrived at difficult conclusions quickly, but he arrived at them honestly, and the conclusion he was arriving at now had been building for 3 years. He thought about the vote. He thought about the silence. He thought about the door. He thought about Chen's face in the chamber, and the garden in Nairobi where she had read his people's message and folded it into her pocket. He thought about the word free. In standard diplomatic language, free meant without cost. But there was another meaning, and he suspected the humans had meant both at once, because that was how they seemed to communicate. Simple words, double meanings, a grin behind the eyes. Free also meant you didn't earn this, we gave it to you. And we gave it to you because we chose to, not because you asked. He picked up the document with the 31 points and read it again from the beginning. The signing was not held in the conclave chamber. This had been one of the human conditions, not one of the 31, but a quiet addition made late in the negotiation. Elder Ambassador Yara Chen had asked in a brief message that the ceremony take place in a neutral room with no flags on the walls. The conclave had agreed, partly because it was a small thing, and partly because after 3 years they had learned to look carefully at the small things humans asked for. The room they used was a conference hall 1 floor below the main chamber. Plain walls, a long table, windows that looked out over the city. Neither impressive nor humiliating. Just a room where 2 parties who had figured out an arrangement could put their names to it. Chen arrived with 4 aides, no ceremony, and a face that gave nothing away. She was 47 years old now, and she moved through the room the way she had always moved through the conclave spaces, as though she had already been there in her mind, and was simply walking through the version that existed in the physical world. She shook hands with Sorath. It was the first time they had been in the same room since the vote 3 years ago. Ambassador, he said. Elder, she said. She sat down at the table. Her aides sat with her. There was a second table, slightly smaller, placed beside the long one, not connected to it, close enough to share the room, far enough to be its own space. This had also been a human condition, not a demand, just a preference, expressed once, not argued about. Chen sat at the second table. Torres beside her watched Sorath register this and file it away. The Vithani elder was good at not showing what he was thinking. But his eyes moved to the 2 tables, and there was a moment, very brief, where something crossed his face that was not quite surprise and not quite respect, but was somewhere between the 2. The document was signed. 23 of the original 31 human conditions were accepted unchanged. 6 were modified in ways that changed very little in practice. 2 were set aside for future discussion. Not 1 was refused entirely. Afterward there was a reception. It was polite and somewhat quiet, the way receptions are when everyone in the room is still adjusting to a new reality. The Drelani delegate Thea found Chen by the windows and stood beside her. You look like someone who got what she came for, Faya said. I came for a signature, Chen said. And before that, when you were planning this? Chen considered the city below. I didn't plan it. I just knew what it needed to be. Faya looked at her for a moment. Was any of it hard? The 3 years? Parts, Chen said, but not the parts you'd expect. She did not say what parts. Faya did not push. They stood together at the window for a little while longer, and then the reception moved on around them. In the weeks that followed the signing, the conclave received the full picture of what had happened inside Sol System during the years of silence. The numbers were staggering. 17 new colonies, established and fully functional across systems that humanity had been surveying quietly for a decade. 2 independent jumpgate networks, one covering the inner Sol System and one stretching toward the frontier, both operational. A food production surplus large enough to supply the entire conclave core for 11 years. A medical research program that had made 3 significant advances during the isolation, none of which had been shared yet. A defense doctrine built entirely around the principle that no outside force should ever be able to reach Earth through a path that humans did not control. And the technology. Not just the lattice. Other things, quieter things, that were being revealed slowly, one piece at a time, in ways that suggested the release schedule had been decided long in advance. Several conclave military advisors began, very carefully and without much fanfare, to request human technical documentation. Some of it was not. Voss, retired from the shipyards now and living on Luna, read the news dispatches from the reception with the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent years building a thing that was never supposed to need to be explained. He had not been invited to the signing. He had not expected to be. He sent Torres a short message that said only, "Good work." Torres forwarded it to Chen, who kept it. On the frontier colony of Kashar, which was the newest and the furthest out, Dio Adeyemi was overseeing the final installation of a terraforming array when the news came through. She read it, nodded once, and went back to work. The young technician beside her, a recent graduate named Min, who had grown up entirely during the isolation years and had never known a time when Sol was part of the conclave, watched her and then asked a question. "What was it like," he said, "when it happened, the vote, and then all of it?" Dio kept working for a moment before she answered. She was looking at the terraforming array, at the way it caught the light of this new sun, at the ground beneath it that had been dead rock 8 months ago, and was now, slowly, becoming something else. "You know when you've been sharing a room with someone," she said, "and it's too small, and they keep moving your things without asking, and you've been meaning to find a bigger place for years, but you never quite do, because it's easier to stay." Min nodded. "And then one day they kick you out," Dio said, "and you're standing on the street for about 10 seconds, feeling sorry for yourself. And then you realize you're on the street. You can go anywhere. You can go everywhere. You can find something 10 times better than that little room, and you already know exactly where it is, because you've been looking at the map for years." She looked at the array, at the sky above it that was the wrong color, but would not always be. "That's what it was like," she said. Sorath requested a private meeting with Chen 6 weeks after the signing. He came alone, which was unusual for him. He sat across from her in a small office, and he looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honestly." "I'll answer honestly," Chen said. "I won't promise to answer completely." He accepted this. "Did you plan it? All of it? Before the vote?" Chen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We planned for a lot of things. We have been planning for a long time. When you've been told for 60 years that you're too much, too loud, too difficult, too alive, you start to think about what happens when they get tired of telling you that." "That's not a yes or a no," Sorath said. "No," she agreed, "it's not." He looked at her for another moment. Then he stood, very correctly, and thanked her for her time, and left. In the corridor outside he paused, and stood still for a moment, with his eyes closed. He was thinking about something a colleague had said to him years ago, before all of this, when humanity had still been a problem to be managed, rather than a fact to be accepted. The colleague had said that the trouble with humans was that they treated adversity like a resource, that every difficulty they encountered, they found a way to metabolize, turn it into fuel. At the time, Sorath had taken this as a complaint. He understood, now, that it had been a warning. The Conclave's official historical record of the exclusion decree and its aftermath ran to 2 pages. It described the vote, the isolation period, and the new treaty in measured, neutral terms. It used the phrase, diplomatic realignment, 3 times. Humanity's internal record of the same events was a library. There were personal accounts, and engineering logs, and council minutes, and field reports from 17 colonies and 100 small stations, and every ship that had been part of every decision. There were messages between people who had been scared, and people who had been furious, and people who had cried in their bunks, and people who had laughed until their chests hurt, because the whole thing was, in the end, so exactly what they had always known was coming. The last line of Earth's official account of the exclusion decree had been written by Chen herself in a quiet room on the evening after the signing. It was not formal language. She had written it for the record, not for posterity, and it had stayed in the record because no one who read it thought it needed to be changed. It read, "Best thing they ever did for us." Outside the window of her office, the saw lattice held, patient and silent, every node lit in the dark. The door was open now. They had opened it themselves, from the inside, on their own terms, on their own time.